All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Innovation Alchemy. As you know, this is the podcast that explores the magic, mess, and mastery of innovation and those bold enough and brilliant enough to build it. Today, I'm joined by three amazing gentlemen, and we're focusing on accessibility, how it's defined, why it's important, and what are the actionable things that you can do as an entrepreneur to really start down a path of making your products and offerings more accessible. To help have that conversation today, we have two guests and a co-host joining me, uniquely well-suited to chat about these things. So who's in the room? My co-host, the hardest working member of the Innovation Alchemy team, John-Marc Vachon, our Director of Marketing and Events at WEtech Alliance. I'm joined by David Best, an accessibility communications specialist and founder of Best Consulting. And last but certainly not least, Jason Pomerleau, the CEO and founder of Elevate Web Studios. Jason, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Jen, so why don't we start off by you diving a little bit more into your experience in this space and what makes you the perfect folks to have around for this conversation. So John-Marc, go ahead.
Yeah, so been with WEtech Alliance in the marketing role for, it'll be 11 years this month, actually. I'm also a board member for John McGivney Children's Center, so we work with children with disabilities. And my wife is the Executive Director of Assisted Living Southwestern Ontario, and I've been working with both David and Jason on accessibility for years now, attending seminars they've hosted and podcasts and reading their blog posts and just like I say this every time, but I learn something new every time I talk to both of you, and I greatly appreciate it.
So a lot of direct experience, but also some osmosis there too. And you've been with WEtech at 12 years, 11 years
11
now?
years.
You don't look a day over 12, so that's interesting.
I appreciate that.
Fantastic. David, what makes you the perfect person to talk to today for this?
Well, that's a good question, Adam. I'm got a lot of lived experiences, I guess. My background is that I developed glaucoma at the age of 5, and by the time I graduated from high school, I had lost all of my vision. I went on to university, graduated with a software engineering degree, started my career with Air Canada, spent a good part of my career with IBM Global Business Services, and for the last 10 years or so, I've worked as an independent consultant in helping small businesses develop communication strategies that actually communicate and connect with people. And I've spent a number of years as an advocate and working with Ontario government as an advisor on the Standards Advisory Committee. So I have a lot of lived experiences.
That's great. Well, we're so lucky to have you with us. And I know you've had a lot of work in the past with WEtech Alliance, both offering insights into our founders' journeys as they develop their own products, but also internally to our team too as we go on our own journey for this. So appreciate you with us. And Jason, what brings you here?
So I've been in the tech business for almost 30 years, and I've been building websites since the late 90s. And accessibility, obviously, from a technology perspective, is a pretty big topic, and has been a big topic for a long time. I think general awareness is increasing and is becoming more important, and even mandated by law in many situations with the AODA. With Ontario government. And so we've been working with David for a couple of years now, and basically making sure that our websites are as accessible as they can possibly be.
That's awesome. And, if you haven't already checked out some of the information out there about this, WEtech has a blog series that David did for us on accessibility. And there's a lot of great stuff that we're going to be citing here today and pulling in. But David, as we kind of frame this conversation and set a foundation for ourselves, why don't you give me what your definition for disability is?
Yeah, disability really is defined around cultural attitudes. So basically there's 3 models that people kind of view disability through. So you can view it through the lens of the charity model. Back in the 19th century and before, people with disabilities were seen as someone who was needy. In the 20th century, we moved into an era where there was advancements in medical technology, and disability became something we saw through a lens as something that can be fixed. So we sort of entered into the attitude of that disability, the disability model. And in this century, the 21st century, we're shifting more and more toward what they refer to as the social model of disability, where we're seeing that society is taking on more of the role of making sure that products and services meet all of the needs of people and that we don't have to fix them or we don't have to make them dependent. And so the view of disability is seen more and more as a human limitation. Mm-hmm. And basically there's 5 categories for the human limitations if you're looking at developing any product and services. So the first one would be vision, whether it's blindness or low vision. And the question would be, do you consider color blindness as a disability? They say about 10% of males are colorblind. The second group is hearing, low hearing, total deafness, and here again, would you consider tone deafness a disability? And then there's the mobility category, which most people view as walkers and wheelchairs. But would you consider somebody who's left-handed as having a disability? If you're in an environment where all the tools are right-handed, then you are at a limitation. The fourth group is cognitive disabilities, where it doesn't impact the level of intelligence, but it's more about how people process information, like dyslexia and things. And a big group that we often don't think much about is environmental, situational, and temporary disabilities. So environmental would be those areas where you're affected by the environment, such as, driving in the early morning toward the rising sun. You end up squinting, or you're in an environment where you're in a very noisy environment, restaurant or on the street, and you're talking on your phone, so you end up texting instead of talking because of the noise. So there's a lot of environmental and situation, and even temporary, such as, you may have a broken arm or something that would temporarily put you back. So the categories are there's the 5 categories, but the question is, when you're thinking about it, why should you care? And if you're human, you should care. So Adam, 3 questions to guarantee that you're human. 1, are you aging?
Absolutely. Every day.
Okay. So you know that as you age, your body's going to be affected by certain functions not acting the way they should. Secondly, are you susceptible to any illnesses or accidents?
Sure, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have a 3-year-old in daycare. I'm ill almost every other week right now.
Yeah. Okay. So you are affected by accidents. Okay. Thirdly, what about temporary things? Are you ever affected by temporary situations, such as if the hydro went out, and the lights went out? Who would be at the disadvantage?
Yeah, me, not you, I'm sure.
Okay. So you pass all 3 categories of human. We know that Adam is not a bot. He's a real person. And that's why we should care about disability and why we need to have a clearly defined definition of what disability is, because it affects everybody.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you framing it in that way. And I think as so many things have evolved over the last kind of decade in the world, it's about understanding where things fall within the spectrum and also recognizing that we're meeting people where they're at within all of our kind of realms of work, but in life as well. We're going to throw the word around accessibility quite a bit in this podcast as well. And I'm wondering if you can give me what that means versus how people kind of casually use it in their everyday nomenclature.
Yeah, accessibility it's a word that's used a lot, and it all depends on the context in which you're using it. But basically, in general, accessibility simply means enablement, something that you are able to access. It enables you to do something you want to do. So, say for example, you get up in the morning, you get out to your car, and you find you don't have the keys. Well, you don't have access to the car. You can't get in it, so you're not going anywhere. So you go in, you find your keys, you come back, and you get in the car, but there's no gas. You're not going anywhere. And that's where it's not usable. You have access to it, but it's simply not usable. And the same with websites. You know, when you have someone design your website, you can make it so it is accessible, so it meets the technical standards. But if there's a problem with the way in which it's designed so that I cannot get past the login, for example, then it's simply not usable. So accessibility is really about having access to something. And I guess a good example would be communication. So if you gave me a print document, I wouldn't be able to read it. I would have to get someone to read it, or I'd have to scan it. And the same thing, if I gave you a Braille document, Adam, and I said, okay, here's the agenda, you read the agenda, you know, you would look at me as if I was crazy, because Braille is something that you don't have access to. Now, you could learn it. It could become something usable to you, but at that point in time, it's simply not something that's accessible. So really, it's all about productivity. It's really about enabling people to be productive. So the question I ask people is your team designing for beauty, or is it designing for functionality? And that's something that you should care about. Why should you care? Because it affects marketing. The more you make things accessible, the bigger your market. And the bigger your market, the greater the return on investment.
I think that's so important to note, is that there is that kind of bottom line effect to accessibility as well. And as we go through this conversation, you know, these podcasts are really for founders, the companies that we work with, but also those that don't necessarily fit within WEtech services, but still want to benefit from kind of the expertise that we bring around the table. And so I think that's a great jumping off point to this conversation, which is this isn't just about, you know, doing what's right or doing what's, you know, adjusting to the human needs, but there's also that business case for it, and it increases your ability to reach markets that otherwise you would not have you know, the opportunity to do so. So, John-Marc, I know you worked with their and David in helping to get those blog series up on the website, and they've offered such great insights into both his world and his perspective. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, David, in your blog series, you talk about the 4 timeless human principles being dignity, independence, integration, and equality. And those are also, and Jason, you talked about the AODA, and those are the 4 principles in that as well. So, actually, I'll start with Jason because I want to bring you into this conversation. Where do you see where can businesses start with integrating that and making that a lens that they look through when they're developing a product?
Yeah, you know, as David pointed out, there's a lot of things that you can do at the sort of design and build stage of the website that can basically make it accessible to those using assistive technologies. And a lot of this stuff has actually been around for a long time, but web developers haven't historically really you know, had the incentive to utilize a lot of this stuff. It's very easy to make a nice looking website that's not accessible if you're not really thinking about these things. But the interesting part is that if you're aware and you know about them, that you can actually bake it into the design build process and just make it sort of part of the product that you're putting together. And the end experience is so much better, you know, versus, you know, coming in after the fact and trying to bolt on, you know, accessibility to an existing website where it wasn't really sort of built in that way. There's so many parallels in the website business with the construction industry, building a house or building a building. You know, when you pour a foundation, it's going to be really hard to alter the footprint of that, you know, of that building after that foundation has been poured. And so when it comes to building websites, you know, just sort of keeping those principles in mind right from the outset can make a huge difference in the results that you know, are achieved.
Mm-hmm. I love the way you said it too. Actually, on David's podcast, who has his own accessibility podcast, I listened to the episode you were on a while back, and I love the way you put it in that episode where you said you don't make accessibility an add-on item on an invoice. It's baked into what you do. You don't make it something that could be cut due to budget limitations or scope limitations. And I really loved the way you phrased that. And if you're making a website, it's part of, you're building it for every single website. So I really like that approach. So David, speaking of your blog post, we're doing a lot of plugging for your blog post here, and as the marketing guy, I feel like you gotta say, if you want to check out David's blog posts, You can go to WEtech-alliance.com/news to check those out. So there's 5 different parts in that series. As of recording, 4 of them are out, and the next one will be out in the next couple of weeks. So of those principles that we talked about, what one do you feel are the most overlooked, and why does that matter?
Yeah, I think they're all important, but I think the one probably that it's misunderstood the most is the integration principle. People tend to focus on accommodating, and accommodating really is only going halfway to meeting the needs of people. So, for example, when you are accommodating someone, you're providing something that they need, but it becomes a repetitive process, and you have to keep providing that accommodation. So, for example, a PDF document, you produce a document, I have to come to you and say, give me an accessible format, and you go off and you do that, you spend time and effort doing that. Tomorrow I come back and do the same thing. So accommodating is really about passive participation, whereas integration, you're integrating the needs of the people right into your strategy, into your business values. And so when you train your content authors to make documents accessible, they follow the standards, I can download the document and read it. I don't have to come back and keep pestering you for our document. So integration is really about understanding the needs of people. So, for example, if you hired me, say, for a developer, I'm working, I've got a computer, you say, oh, great, the Braille display, the screen reader, everything works great. One morning I come in and I can't log in. And I come to you and say, I can't log in anymore. And you say, oh, procurement bought a new security package and you have to use, some sort of graphics interface. And I say, well, I can't do it now. Now I can't do my job. So you have the choice of saying, well, that's no problem. I can accommodate you by signing you in. And then once I sign you in, you're good for the day. So I'm a passive employee at that point. That doesn't really make me feel all that good. But if you say, oh, okay, that's not really acceptable, that doesn't align with our company values, I'm going to go to procurement and find out why they went ahead and purchased this tool without coming to us and letting us know what the tool was and what impact it would have on our employees. And in that case, integration becomes part of the company strategies. It takes your values and it puts them into a position where you actually do something about them and you actually make people become productive. And back to what we said, accessibility is about access, giving people access so they can be productive.
I can maybe just add to that as well. It is the difference, in our team. One of the things that we do is that the entire team goes through training, which is refreshed on a fairly regular basis, at least annually, on that everything we do, every piece of work that we produce must be secure and must be accessible. And so we're talking about accessibility today. Security is another big thing in the technology world. And it just, those two things just, if they're just baked into your process and you're sort of in your DNA, so to speak, then they just become automatic. Yeah. And that's really the type of thing we try to foster in our team is, with sort of every bit of work that we're producing, is it secure? Is it accessible? Versus, well, we'll worry about that at the end, and we'll have, David come in and to use your example, of procuring the security software, it would have been more of a conversation at the procurement phase as opposed to, okay, we bought this thing and now we found a problem, and it just becomes a part of every conversation.
I mean, you hit on something interesting. Actually, there's a couple things there that I think we need to unpack. One is that there's a marriage between security and accessibility, and that when you think of, or when our startup founders think of security, oftentimes it's something that's solved for later. And to your point, when you're building a foundation of something, it's much harder to change later than it is at baking it at the beginning. But founders all the time in the technical space have something called technical debt, which is this idea that you build now and idea that you're going to pay back something later. There's additional work that has to get paid back later. But I think that goes to thinking about this work as more of a checkbox than something that actually drives growth and drives adoption. And so, David, why do you think that so many businesses really treat accessibility still like just compliance versus an opportunity?
I think because they can. The problem I think that we have is that when there's no enforcement, you don't have to do something, you don't do it. And when there's no enforcement, there's no accountability. So if there's nobody responsible for a particular task, I can't go to somebody and hold them responsible, and they're not enforced to do it. So if there's no accountability, then there's no justice, which means I never get heard or my challenges are ignored. And if that happens, social values break down and discord becomes discord. And so I think what happens is a lot of, especially small businesses that have a lot of regulations to follow, they tend to depend a lot on expert advice. So you have someone come to you like me, that's an accessibility advocate, and say, you really have to make your website accessible because it's the law. Ontario says that there's standards, and if you don't meet those standards, you could be subject to very heavy fines. And believe it or not, a lot of small business feel that they're not obligated because they have less than 50 employees. But the regulation states that if you have one employee, you are responsible to meet the guidelines. So the challenge is to understand the jurisdiction. What are the legal obligations? But how do they align with your values? Because it's really your company values that really matter. So don't think about it as a legal obligation, but think of it about it that you treasure your business values and that you want to meet the customer needs. Now, you can't meet everybody's needs, so you need to prioritize what the problems are, what the challenges are, and you take your values and you put strategies in place that allow you to move forward. And you don't solve all the problems at once, but you do it iteratively. You take one problem, and then you take the next, and you do that not by compliance, but you do that by interacting with your customer base. You do that by interacting with your employees and getting their feedback and getting what they feel is important and building on that so that it's not a checkbox, but rather it becomes something that people really value. And that's how you build loyalty. Consumers today are very intelligent. We have a lot of information at our fingertips. So loyalty and building trust is so important.
Yeah, I think what you're hitting on is differentiator as well. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, Jason, because I think, as you're building this stuff within and without, right, it becomes a holistic approach. You have to ensure that your team is taken care of and met where their needs are at. And then that translates into that product, right, and how it comes outward. But in this day and age where we're dealing with AI that can create code, at the speed of light, the moat that a lot of companies used to have is really thin now. And so differentiator becomes this really important thing. And differentiator is no longer in the code itself or in how it's presented or in the product itself. It becomes those values. And if you can hold those values, there's a lot of web developers, but maybe talk a little bit about how that's become a differentiator and a wedge for your company in this very crowded space.
I think it's been certainly become more and more of a topic, and it can also be like a growth lever as well. So one of the things I like to point out is that doing accessibility well actually there's a remarkable amount of overlap with good accessibility practices on a website and good search engine optimization, which is something a lot of business owners, that's a language they understand, and that's all about reaching the most number of people. Well, it turns out that a lot of the things that you can do to make your website accessible also make it easier for search engines to discover and grab the content on the website. And so what I sometimes say is if you're not going to do it for them, do it for you. And the taking these and adopting some of these techniques and taking these approaches also has a tangible effect on business outcomes that aren't necessarily like directly tying back to accessibility, but it's just that much easier for other, because here's the thing, with assistive tech, it's all about, for example, with a screen reader device, it's all about machines understanding, what's on the screen there in front of you. And when it comes to search engines looking at your website, it's a machine looking at your website. And.
It's interesting that studies show that there are two major factors that result in business failures. And the question that the studies look at is, why do very large, successful companies fail? And they found that there's two factors that are involved there. One is cultural arrogance. And that can be seen, one of the big studies is, or one of the big companies that really stands out was Blockbusters. At one time they had video stores across North America, and they said, people will never watch videos online. Online's too sporadic. And this was, back in the 90s. And today, what video stores still exist? And so it was cultural arrogance that brought them down. They were just too proud to think that, we're doing the right thing and we don't need to change our business model. And they weren't in touch with the trends. The second thing they found was something called system blindness. And that's a good example of that was what happened to Nortel. There was so much internal competition that managers did not share information and departments didn't share information. So what happened was there was a lot of silos that got created going up the company, and there wasn't cross-pollination between departments. And system blindness is something that happens a lot in our organizations. I find that system blindness is something that really affects our government institutions and municipal government, because there seems to be so many blind spots in our organizations, and trying to make policies become reality. It's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to actually create a strategy to do something about it.
It's interesting that the hard truth of what's effective against those two big risks is empathy and diversity of thought. And that's really exactly what we're talking about today is taking into account the experience of others and building experiences, whether that's internally within your team or externally for your customers to address those needs.
Yeah, and I think that ties in really well with kind of the next question I had, which I want to actually open up to both of you because you both kind of touched on it already. You spoke about screen readers. You talked about as a business owner, you think you're doing the right thing. You try to integrate elements. David, I've had this conversation with you about like plugins and widgets specifically that are designed for accessibility improvements, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. So in your case specifically, you had told me integrating some of those plugins can actually make it much worse for you, much harder for you to be able to read using your screen reader, you read a website because it takes over. So this is kind of an open question for both of you, but like there's certain communication strategies that are helpful that you think are helpful end up being a detriment. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So what can business owners, and this is open to both of you, what can they do?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think basically it's just a lack of awareness as to what needs to be done. There's two global trends, that you need to follow if you want to have a successful business. One is the technology innovations, which gets a lot of attention. Every day there's new devices coming out. But the other trend that gets less attention is the human rights movement. And we need to focus on that if we want our business to grow, because you need to design with inclusion. If you don't design with inclusion in mind, you get a lot of misinformation, a lot of false positives. You think you're doing the right thing, but in the long run, you find out that all that effort was for naught. And I think you can look at some of the successful companies out there. Why are they successful? And, the first one I look at that's the most obvious is Apple. Apple, Steve Jobs started it in his garage, and his primary value was for the user. The user's important. And I've heard stories where he was very hard on his engineers as the company grew. They would come and say, I have this great feature or this great product. And he would simply say, is it usable? And, he would burst a lot of bubbles. And I can walk into any Apple store and I can pick up a product and use it right off the shelf. Why? Because way back at the very start, the value was, designed for the customer. So the very first iPhone had VoiceOver, a built-in screen reader. I didn't have to find a third-party vendor to install stuff for me and configure it. So that's the first example. The other example that I find quite amazing is that there are a lot of companies out there that are looking to either scam you or take advantage of your ignorance. And one of the areas that really affects small companies is the AI accessibility overlays. You could have a company come to you and say, we have this widget, we plug it into your website, and poof, all your accessibility problems are solved. You don't have to worry about it. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, you're not learning anything. Mm-hmm. Secondly, your business is dependent on a third-party vendor that's totally in control of what's happening. So the question is, are these AI overlays really useful? Well, for some people they might be, because you can change the font, you can change the colors. But the question I ask is, well, why are you paying a third-party vendor for that when your browser has it already? It's built right into the browser.
Yeah.
The second thing is, they don't recognize assistive technologies. Screen readers and other assistive technologies have powerful built-in functions that allow me to do navigation and searches and what have you. But as soon as you put in a widget, it blows up the assistive technologies. The assistive technologies no longer has control, and my key commands change and everything changes. So it doesn't help. So I think that people think they're doing the right thing when they say, oh, I have this widget that's going to solve my accessibility problems. And I say, sadly, you really need to educate yourself. You really need to become more aware of your community, your local customers, your people that are using your website. Put some feedback mechanisms on there. So when I come on your website and I see a problem like this or something else, give me an opportunity to let you know, because that's really what matters.
Yeah, that's a great example. You talked about earlier on being more of a passive, basically waiting for somebody to complain before addressing an issue. That's an example of being a little more proactive, is making it a little easier for people to provide that feedback.
Just to add to something you said, David, when you talked about Steve Jobs and his approach, usability first, that there's a famous presentation he was giving where someone was asking him, a question, and when his response was, you can't start with the technology and then try to work backward and figure out what to do with it. You have to start with the customer. You have to start with the user. And I think it just speaks to this idea that if it's just part of your DNA, if it's part of your core principles, it just becomes automatic at sort of each stage. To speak to these overlays, David has spent a considerable amount of time and energy learning his screen reading software to get the most out of it. Well, these overlays, as he mentioned, basically render his assistive tech kind of mood. And now he has to learn a new system just to navigate your website.
Right.
And so there's added friction still there that isn't necessary. I think you made a good point. All this stuff is built into the browsers. But if the team that built the website wasn't actually building it and making sure that those capabilities were able to be leveraged, then you have an inaccessible website, and now all of a sudden you need to think about, how do I solve this problem? Oh, look, there's this shiny product out there for $200 a month that's going to, just like solve this problem for me. And it then becomes just another barrier for folks using assistive tech.
Yeah, I think it comes down to one, there's no real shortcuts in this work, and two, as you build something into the foundation of what you're doing, your business ethos, it really becomes about that journey of accessibility and less about a destination. Everything is changing all the time, from technology to user needs to customer needs to internal team requirements. And so the idea that we can just, plop a widget in and set it and forget it, that doesn't work in business. And no business, David, to your point of why businesses fail, stagnation means death in that business world.
Yeah.
And so the idea that, you don't have to continue on with this journey is false in so many ways in the business world.
Yeah, it makes me think back when I graduated from university. I went for an interview. Air Canada set up a whole new office automation department, and I was approached and asked if I was like to join the team. So I remember going down to Toronto to the head office for an interview, and I met with the head of the computer department there, and he said, "No, this will never work." He says, "The computers, CRTs displays are all analog. We don't have any way of connecting, braille displays and voice displays on the equipment." And I simply said to him, "If you don't give me a problem to solve, I can't solve the problem."
Yeah.
So they said, "Okay, we'll give you 6 months." So Air Canada gave me 6 months. They said, "If you can prove that you can be productive in 6 months, we'll hire you full time." Well, before 6 months was up, I was hired on, and it opened a whole new door of innovation for Air Canada. I was able to work with data general engineers, and we came up because I was able to show them the technology I used and how I did things. The engineers came up with new microcomputers at that time with serial interports that allowed me to connect my equipment. And at the same time, I was able to work with special technology innovators that develop things like screen readers. And Air Canada happened to be the incubator for all this. So cool. It shows you that you just have to be open to ideas.
That's so remarkable.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about accessibility versus usability, and sometimes it's accessibility in quotes, because you think you're, like we've talked about, you think you're doing the right thing. For example, putting a plugin in there that now takes over your screen reader and makes it harder to access. So question for you, David, is why do you think usability is such a missing piece of the puzzle?
Well, I think because it's just a lack of awareness.
Yep.
I think people tend to go halfway. We're in such a hurry to get things done. We're so distracted today with a lot of other things. And I think if you are forced to understand that it's compliance, you got to, you look at that, okay, I get it done, okay, forget it. But I once heard someone say, which had a big impact on me, say that the user interface, the UI, is the horse. It's the riggings, it's the saddle, the stirrups, the reins. But the user experience, UX, is actually getting to ride the horse, actually doing something with it. So I hear a lot about these autonomous cars, self-driving cars, and I can appreciate that they're a marvelous innovation, but until I actually get to ride one and drive one, I can't really appreciate the value of that car. So I think the usability is something that we need to make sure that it's not just meeting a checkbox, that it's something that people can actually get that experience. And it's all about opportunities. You've got to create that opportunity. So, for example, in the city of Windsor, we have the city that installs audible signals. And that's great. That's part of the law. The Ontario says you have to have audible signals. So city goes out and puts audible signals at every corner. The question is, are they any value? Do they work? Are they efficient? And for most part, you talk to anybody that depends on it, will tell you no, they're absolutely useless. My safety is compromised because the engineers didn't really know what they were doing. They were told to put them in, so they put them in, but they don't know how I, as a blind person, use them, so they didn't look at the usability aspect of it.
so many things are going off in my head about like we talk to our clients about this stuff all the time about just customer discovery, about how to build the minimum viable product the right way. Instead of, taking one thing at a time and building it up as a pyramid, you take a slice of everything. And David, you talked about that early on about just like it's an iterative process. But like the customer discovery piece is such a big component of it. I know I remember talking to someone that was in a wheelchair years ago that we're trying to enter a building that had the handy accessible button there to open the doors for you and everything. But where the button was located made it impossible for them to use without getting crushed by the door before the door opened. So like just accessibility versus usability. That's a great example of that. So Jason, I know you've talked about how you integrate accessibility into everything you do with your business, and it's not an additional line item that can be added or subtracted. Resources are always a consideration for businesses out there. And, we've talked about you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. If low-hanging fruit-wise, if you had to choose like one single most impactful usability improvement that a website could make in the short term, what would you suggest?
Actually, it's a really easy one, and it's not even one that's really focused around accessibility itself, but around the usability, and it's simplifying your website navigation. Now, I said it was simple. I didn't say it was easy. It just gets harder as the amount of stuff you've got on your website grows, right? But your website can be the most accessible thing in the world from a sort of letter of the law perspective. But if you've got 18 choices in your main navigation, you have a usability problem. And that problem manifests for those of us not using assistive tech as decision fatigue. Oh gosh, here's like, what do I do here? I'm confused about this navigation. What choice do I make? And sometimes what will even happen is that, it just becomes too cognitively difficult and we just leave. And so we never really kind of go back. But something like that affects someone like David even more. So he will use his screen reading device and he will start tabbing through the navigation items, and there's one after the other, after the other, after the other. Yeah. And so it's simple, but not easy. And so you have to prioritize and like really relentlessly pare down those options. And it's quite an exercise to do so, but it is like the single, maybe most impactful one. And the problem is, of course, you've got stakeholders or bosses who say, well, these 18 things are important and they're all, but when 18 things are equally important, nothing is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a lot of businesses, when just look at it through the business lens, a lot of businesses make 80% of their profit from 20% of their customers. And so relentlessly focusing on those core audiences and instead of trying to sort of please everyone, from okay, we've got, 18 different markets that we serve, is to really just focus in on those essentials and that just makes things, people land on the website when there's 3 or 4 choices. It's easier for them to go, oh, that's me.
Yeah.
And like, okay, that's for me. And they can very quickly do that. But when you've got 18 items to scan, it just gets harder and harder to kind of go, okay, maybe that sounds like me, but let me keep going.
Oh, for sure.
And I'll get to the 18th item, and then I'll have to go back and decide which one was for me.
Yeah. Well, like with the screen reader, you gave that as an example. David, I remember you were in our office several years back, and you went through our website with your screen reader, and I got to hear how you experienced it, and it was wild.
It's pretty humbling.
Our dev team, we use the screen reader. So when our dev team is testing stuff, we will actually, like for a moment, pretend we're David and just like go through the website with a screen reading.
Such a different
tech.
experience.
And see. And the other thing, I think you brought up a good idea on the drive here, which was try and use it without your mouse. Try and use the website without the mouse. Use the keys. So you use the tab button to tab through your navigation, space bar to click or enter to click, and see how that experience kind of works out, for you. Is it possible to do? In our business, we're big on shortcuts, and it turns out that the mouse is actually the the longest way to do lots of things. And so a part of our team orientation is I do this grandiose speech of the mouse is for losers. And so this is what I'll tell our new staff, right? And so the more you can actually use the keyboard to navigate your computer, the more efficient you're actually going to be, which turns out to be exactly what folks like David can leverage as well to much greater effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, Jason, because there's many solutions to a problem. As I said, give me a problem, I'll solve it. But there's many ways of solving that problem. So there's many different browsers, many different screen readers, many different computer platforms, and it's impossible to test everything, every possible combination, every possible disability, so you've got to decide what is your design philosophy, how are you going to attack it, and the best way to do it is at the very beginning, the very design level, include people that are going to use your product, people who are possibly blind or mobile, whatever your product, whatever the primary focus of your product is going to hit. Include those people at the design level, because when you get to the development, developers have hundreds of ways of solving one problem, and the way they do it may affect one screen reader one way and another one a different way. Yeah. And so you need to be able to understand what the combinations are. So there is no one simple solution to creating a website, except that you pay attention to what your developers and designers are doing.
So David, you really took us through this idea that accommodation and integration is a mile wide gap between the two. And that businesses that are starting to focus on this, the day-to-day really looks like that within and without, that it has to start within a business. And Jason, you hit on this as well, and how you build things internally is like, this is a focus internally to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the tools that we're using and they all have that ability to do so. But then that translates out. And then you kind of went a step further by describing that way that focus helps to really hone in on something. And I touched on that differentiator piece, right? Where it's like, that's such an important part to business. But to your point, I think, and where it all centers around is if you're trying to be everything to everyone, then you're nothing to anyone. If everything's important, as you said directly, then nothing is important. And so I know John-Marc is gonna touch on, I think, the metrics that we look at as this for the next piece. But David, I want to get an understanding from your perspective. You talked about that accommodation to integration piece. You talked about usability, but as someone with lived experience here, do you see this improving within the business community generally? Is all of this technology that we have now at our fingertips making it easier for you to connect to the world, or is it still hard?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And as I said, we got to focus on not only the technology trends, but the human right trends. And one of the problems we have right now with our education system is that we have graduates coming out of business school, engineering, computer science that haven't got a clue what a screen reader is. I mean, they're really great designers and programmers, but they haven't got a clue how people actually use that technology. So I think things are changing. We are getting more and more awareness out there because people are using the internet more, so they are becoming more aware. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misleading and scams out there that sort of sidetracked us. But I think if you think back to one of the prominent inventions that changed our lives was the printing press. However, the printing press, printing all those books would have been useless if people can't afford to buy the book or they can't even read. So like the printing press, the invention of the World Wide Web based on the internet infrastructure opened a whole new door for people who are blind. All of a sudden, like the printing press, we had access to amazing information right at our fingertips. I had a screen reader where I could load up a web page, download documents. That was an amazing step forward. However, if web designers do not create according to standards, they don't create the content that meets the needs of people according to the WCAG standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, then the World Wide Web is absolutely useless for people that, don't use it in the normal convention.
Yeah.
So going forward, I think AI is going to have a huge impact on supporting people with disabilities and giving them more independence. And the problem, though, is we need to make sure that the designer biases are not built into those AI systems, because today the problem we have with AI large language models is that they have a lot of inherent biases of people. So two things that we need to make sure that our designers understand is that you are designing for the wants of people or you're designing for the needs of people. So you design for the wants of people because that's the low-hanging fruit. Everybody needs groceries. So we all go to the grocery store to get groceries. However, when you go to the grocery store, you drive in the parking lot and you see this huge parking lot, you find a parking, you go in. When I go to a grocery store, I got to walk through acres of cars, bouncing off this car and that car to find the main door. Why do they design for the wants of people wanting groceries, but they don't design for the needs of people to get into the store? So the same is with these AI systems. We need to make sure that we are designing going forward, that we are designing for the needs, not just the wants. And I think the second thing that's going to help improve the the whole area of accessibility is in partnerships. I think organizations like WEtech and others, is that partnerships and mentoring is extremely important. If we have very smart inventors, innovative people on our team, they need to be able to connect with people so that they understand the needs. So the question I have is, does the organization you belong to, does it have a partnership? Does it connect with local disability service organizations? Can your organization, having an event of some kind, say we have an organization that has access, that can give people with disabilities an opportunity to participate in our events? And at the same time, does it give our business people that are scaling up their business an opportunity to sit down with someone like myself and talk about the scale-up process and what the product and services provide? And I can talk about what my needs are so that as they're building that business, they can incorporate those needs into the business. So I think business partnerships and mentoring is really important, which is something that's missing today.
I agree. It reminds me, I spent some time in Boston a year and a half ago, and I got to walk the campus of Harvard and MIT, and you wonder how so much brilliance can be concentrated in such a small geographic place. And what I learned was that departments interdepartmentally are connected by tunnel underground at MIT, and they have singular places where folks from Harvard and MIT and all the other great schools in that area actually come together and talk about new technologies and new opportunities. And it's in the cross-pollination that you actually get that outcome of innovation and furthered furthered human existence, right? Like what's driving us forward is that connectivity piece. And so I think that's so important. Yeah. I really appreciate your comments there. Because I think it rings very true across just about everything that we do as human beings right now.
Just to touch on just something that David said, and this is a podcast for founders, and one of the things we're talking about is involving folks early and baking this into your design process and so on and so forth. But this is just good general startup advice. So many startups begin with the end in mind, and they build something that actually turns out nobody wants because they haven't actually involved the people that are going to be using the product and service, right? So there's this idea that I sometimes say ideas are worth nothing, execution is everything. But like you can have the greatest idea in the world, execute on it, and build something but nobody wants it. Yeah. And the more you involve the people that are going to be using it, the better off you're going to be as a business, and then the more accessible your product or service will be.
It's more cost effective and sustainable as well.
Yeah, and it comes back to customer discovery again, so we talk about with all of our clients.
Right. Yes. You got to spend time with them.
100%.
Right?
So kind of on that front, talking about like the metrics involved in it, and how do you respond to, David, you mentioned this earlier about, smaller businesses under 50 employees often think that this doesn't apply to them. They don't have to be compliant. It's more of a compliance issue. How do you kind of respond to businesses that say that have that feeling that they're just too small? It's more of a compliance thing versus an optimization, or even making the business case like you've done many times, where it's not just checking a box. It actually makes business sense to be more accessible.
I'm surprised when I hear people say that, they'll do it later, they got other things to do, or, they're too small. If you take that attitude, you'll always be small. You'll never grow. Your company, you need to be able to take risks. You need to be able to take opportunities that come. And I think the problem goes back to what I said earlier. It's a matter of awareness. We need to give our startup companies and our entrepreneurs opportunities to meet with people of various diversity types, needs and what have you. But I think one of the big challenges that we might experience is unrealized disabilities. Last year, the Business Development Center did a study, and I found it interesting that they were doing a study on why scale-up fail and why are there fewer entrepreneurs entering the market. And they basically came to the conclusion that there's a lack of support resources. And I was looking at it and I thought, wow, it's very interesting that they uncovered a really important point, but never really highlighted it. And they were saying that they found that people with neurodivergent disabilities, people with ADHD made really good entrepreneurs because they were risk takers, they were innovators, they were energetic, but they tended to have a problem with impulsiveness, or they were in conflict with people. They were distracted with other things. And I thought, there's a typical example of what I would refer to as an unrealized disability, because we have people in the business world that are decision makers, they're leaders, and they either do not admit they have a human limitations or they're totally unaware of it. And I can remember many times in the corporate world where I butted heads with management because we simply didn't see eye to eye. And I look back and I think, well, if I only understood their perspective, that manager happened to have ADHD, and no wonder he was off the record. I couldn't get him to sit down and talk to me, And so if we had people that had support resources that could help them understand what their unrealized disability is and how it not only affects them, but it impacts everybody around them.
Absolutely. I think I want to tie it off there, because you said something really profound, which is if you have this mentality that as a founder, you're too small to do this work, you're too small to start, you're too small to take a risk or to build boldly in this space, then you're always going to stay that way. And I think, the message that we've gotten here today from your insights, and I want to thank you both for that, is that this work is about getting messy, getting it wrong, trying again, iterating over and over until you have a journey behind you that is something you can be proud of and is, really aligned to the values that you've set out as a business. And so I appreciate you both so much. And John-Marc, thanks so much for being a co-host for this one.
It's nice to be on this side of the
you should do it more often.
Yeah, I'll have that.
And until next time, this is Innovation Alchemy. I'm Adam Castle.